Alright, so I have improved our demo since the last time we've met. So I'm gonna start by showing you guys the server. Um, I'm just gonna walk you step by step kind of what the thought process is behind everything. So things that are new, we've got an action listener implemented now. So basically if there's any buttons on the page, the action listener will fire off and we can do things. So we've added a screen, a default screen basically. Since the server doesn't have multiple screens, we're just going to throw the screen in the server, and the screen is just something that all of the components can be added to. And so we've got a text area called the CMD or command, whatever, a scroll pane for scrolling. We've got a start button, we've got a clear button, we've got an array list of user accounts. And so user accounts is just a user client and an account. So you'll see those a lot, user accounts. It's literally just when the client connects, it gives you the user client and the account, and we're just saving it both in one file, one object. So, and we call this online users. So basically, everyone who's online is going to be in here, and when they disconnect, we're going to remove them from this list. So here we just set up the code, the UI, basically setting up the CMD to a new text area. And this is all using my Byrd engine, so I'm gonna so this may be your first time looking at the GUI with Byrd engine. So btext area is just a text area, and you put the bounds of where you want it to be and what screen you'd like it to be on. Which actually we don't need to be doing that because scroll is gonna steal it. And then scroll, this is just a JScroll pane, nothing that I've made in the Byrd engine. And we're gonna add the scroll to the default screen. Start button is going to start the server and stop the server. The clear button will clear the text of the CMD, and then default screen, we're just going to set visible to true because we set it to false up here. Make sure everything loads nicely. The nest, just like we did in the previous video. Online users, we're just setting that up, setting it equal to a new array list. Boom. And so if you notice here, the nest has a save location, server demo / save logs, and I've already run this, but it'll make a folder that looks something like this, user accounts, and it'll make you a little database. But I'm going to delete mine just to show you guys a fresh, clean slate here. So I made a method called getUserAccount, and basically some of these methods that come from the interface don't have the account that we're looking for, and they don't know what user count is because that's something we've made for this project. So I made a method that will get the account, the user account, based on just the user client that it sends through each of these by default. So it's just a for loop that will return if basically if it finds the user client equals to this user client that we've passed in, it's going to return the user account for us. Broadcast is going to take all the user accounts that we've just used, and you can see a.getUserAccount is being used here. It gets used all over the place. But broadcast is going to send, it's going to get all of the user accounts, then it's going to get the client inside of all the accounts, and then it's going to send an object, and that's going to be username, which is a parameter here, plus, colon and a message. So this is going to look like the chat. The cmd.addText, it's going to show you it in the server here. So this is what the server looks like when you run it. Just going to show you real quick. I probably should have done that. And if you can see here, it says new Byrd base created at this location. So that's cool. But yeah, so if I wanted to start, click start. If I wanted to clear the server, I'd do that. I'm going to wait just a second. Finish explaining what the server looks like now. And we'll go back in. So on object received, we're going to broadcast. And broadcast will add the text. So anytime we receive any kind of object, if it's a string, we're just going to broadcast it. On connection lost, we're going to get the username of the get user client. So we have the user client here. We're going to get the user account. Then we're going to remove it from the online users list. We're going to try to disconnect it. It's not that big of a deal. We could go without that code, but I like it. It tries to close all the streams that are open, so it's a good thing to do. And then we're going to broadcast has left the chat. It's going to say username plus has left the chat. So that's cool. On connection lost, it'll tell everyone if they've lost or left. On account connected, we're going to start a connection. We're going to say online users.add new user account. Remember, it's just user account and account, or user client and account. And then broadcast has joined the chat, so everyone can see that they've joined. And then for our buttons, we have the action performed from our action listener here, and that is start button. So basically, if the server is not on, we're going to turn it on, and we're going to set the button's text to stop. And if the server is on, then we're going to close the server and set the text to start. And then the clear button is just going to clear the text of the CMD, or set the text to null pretty much. So yeah, that's what the server code looks like under the hood. As you can see, I've added a little bit, but not so much that all that different. I kind of told you in the last video that you would add like a couple things here and there, and all I really added was UI, and other than user accounts, which is just an organized way to organize all the clients that have connected. Not much has changed code wise. So this is here, the server, and I'll start it, and then I will run the client just to show you what it looks like. So the client, I made two screens for. I made a login screen and I made a chat screen. So this is the login screen. Basically, you gotta input your stuff. I just set it to default these things because the server runs on this port. I'm just going to default it there, but say there's different servers, different ports, that kind of stuff. You can choose whichever one you'd like. Username, anything, admin. I have to Google how to make it stars or whatever instead of letters. But yeah, so we just created the database on the server. So if we try to log in, it's going to give us an error here. This here is a it's there to catch errors. So unknown user account. I have to make this label longer, but so it doesn't even know this account. So if I try to create the account, lets me. Admin has joined the chat. Hello world. Awesome. So I can press enter to send it, or I can, of course, press the button and I can leave, but I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to create another one. Let's call this one Steve. Steve will try to log in or create an account. So Steve has joined the chat, and we both see that because it broadcasts. And if you look at the server, anything that broadcasts is also added to this CMD, if you remember that. So now when I try to say something like, hey Steve, Steve is just going to see, hey Steve, and hey. And so say Steve is leaving or Steve gets kicked out. Steve has left the chat. Cool. Steve has left the chat. So that's just a really quick, cool client server app, and I will show you now the client and the other two screens. So what we do with the client, really not all that much. An action listener, and two screens here, the login screen, the chat screen, and then we're gonna save the user client server when we get it. And so there's that. We didn't do that in the last video. So here we're going to create the login screen and the chat screen, and by default they're both set visible to false, so I set the login screen visible to true here. The on error, I showed you a little example of that. So something like the user account name is taken or something, it'll send you these chirps, and basically if you take a chirp and take it to string, it'll give you a good idea of what kind of error, where you messed up in the joining process, the authentication process. So I just say login screen dot info label, set the text to chirp.toString. So that's what errors do. Also, you could also chirp and then press Control Space for the intel. Never mind. No, wait. Chirp, capital C, Control Space, dot. There you go. Now you can see all of them. So there's connected, there's create user account, incorrect password, user account, unknown user account, and then user account taken. So that's cool. Now we've got onConnect, which so basically when we get our server, we're going to set the login screen to false, and we're going to set the password box to none. So basically if they leave, their password isn't there still. Everything else can be there still. It can save the username, that's not a problem, but don't save the password. Chat screen is going to come up now, and then we're going to set our local variable server to this server here, and chat screen, we're going to give the server to the chat screen as well, and we're going to connection.start the server so that these two methods will run. And so once we start the server, we can start receiving objects. When we get objects, we see if they're strings, and if they're strings, then we give it to the chat screen. On connection lost, close the chat screen and login screen, set that one to visible. Open up the login screen, and then on action performed. So if we leave, we're gonna close the chat screen and open up the login screen, just the same as if connection is lost. There. So now we're gonna look at the screens. The login screen. These are mostly just UI. So input boxes, buttons, labels, and then we've got the client listener, which I like to. If you remember, we implement client listener. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn it into a object that we store here, the listener, and we can get it from client E because we're asking for it. When we create the login screen, we pass this, and this is a client listener. It implements it. So it's also a B frame, so we can say super E, and because it's a B frame, that works. We're going to set it visible to false for testing purposes, but it's also better for the UI to load that way. All those labels don't need to be saved, the IP port, username, password, that kind of stuff, so we just make them on the fly. But the IP box, the port box, these things need to be saved. And they all look the same. Just throwing in the bounds here, I don't use relative location, I just set the exact location. It helps for if I would like to resize it, so I could set this to resizable, and when I run it, I don't even know what that is. Okay, set it to true, and everything resizes. If you can tell, login screen's not so big, now it's huge, that kind of thing. So yeah, so if I create things with Byrd engine, such as a B label or B something, then it will be resizable. Oh, but The only reason I have it on false is because the J scrolls, I haven't created a B J scroll yet, which it's gonna happen next. But yeah. So then the B button here is the only thing that looks different out of all of these. It has a this before the numbers, and that's because we are looking for an action listener. That's the most important part of the button. So implements action listener, so we just say this. This for most of the buttons, for all of the buttons on this page. And then we have the label, just says welcome, set it up, and it's all good. The listener is equal to E, the client, and then for dev purposes, we're just going to say localhost and set the text to default, those two things. Now we go on to the action performed. If we're going to press go, we're going to try connection.login, and these are the parameters for connection.login. This is why we need the listener as an object. So when we press the button, we have the listener ready to use. And then we just get the text from everything. So the IP box we can get the text from, because the port is an integer, we're going to have to use integer.parse. And it'll say error if you put letters into that box. It's gonna throw an exception. That's fine. The username and password box are just getting the text from, and then we have the listener. However, if we use create, it'll be actually the complete exact same. So yeah, it's just too easy buttons right there. Just using the connection that I showed you last time. We used connection.join because it was a server that didn't use the stuff, and because we have a save path here, it's going to be building a database, and that is what turns on the authentication. Alright, and so that is the login screen, and then now we have the chat screen, which looks a lot like the server. We have the B text area, the scroll, which will soon be B scroll pane, B input box, B buttons, user client, and yeah, so this will hold the server instead of the listener. So when you give it the client E, it's going to set up everything as we've seen before. If you see here, the leave button is actually set its action listener to client E, so that's why in client at the very bottom we see the chat screen dot leave button here. And then we've got E root pane here. Basically whenever I press enter, it's the default button, so it's going to send that code there. So that's a quick cool little feature there, just one line of code to do that. And you see how we were using close instead of just set visible false. It's because we need to set it visible false, and we need to set the server equal to null, because we don't want an old server that doesn't work. And so when we do get a new server, we can use setup server, user client server, and this is just going to set the server for you. On message received, we get a message, and we just add it to the text area. Easy. Send button, we're just going to say if the server is not equal to null, which is why we need to set it to null if we're not using it. Send the object. So basically if I press enter randomly, I think even if this is set visible false, it's going to try to run this here. But because the server is set visible to null, or set to null, it's not going to be doing this code here. So if we do have a server, we're going to send the object of whatever's in the input box, and then we're going to set the input box text to nothing. So that way it resets and everything's good. So this is my app. I'll show you one more time. It makes a database here, useraccounts.bb. I'll make another video showing you how to use the database and how to access even the accounts inside of that database, that kind of stuff. I'll make that video probably next. That's a really fun one. Admin, and I'm going to zip my project here up in a zip folder, and I will make it available on my website. Log in so you guys can have the code. See, Steve has joined the chat. Admin has joined the chat. Testing. You know what we could see actually? Steve. Login. Incorrect password. Okay. Unknown user account. What else do we have? I think that's it, really. That kind of stuff. All right. Well, cool. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you check out the code. Peace.